everyone, and thank you for joining us for another lecture in our series on monolingualism and multilingualism. My name is Hannah Dahlberg-Dodd, and I am a project assistant professor here at Tokyo College and one of the organizers of this series. This series explores linguistic diversity from a transdisciplinary perspective, covering issues surrounding monolingualism and multilingualism and potential solutions at global and local scales. Today's speaker is Professor David Gramling. Professor Gramling is head of the Department of Central, Eastern, and Northern European Studies at the University of British Columbia. As a specialist of language, sustainability, and transnationalism, they are the author, editor, or translator of numerous publications, including The Invention of Multilingualism, the 2016 The Invention of Monolingualism, which was awarded the American Association for Applied Linguistics Book Award in 2018, and coming this year, Literature of Late Monolingualism. Professor Gramling is also an editorial board member of Transgender Studies Quarterly and German Quarterly, and was founding editor with Chantal Warner of the journal Critical Multilingualism Studies. Today, they will be discussing late monolingualism. Professor Gramling, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Hannah. Hello, everybody. I'm coming to you from the unceded and ancestral territory of the Humkaminam-speaking Musqueam people in what is today briefly known as Canada. So I'm in Vancouver, Canada, coming to you from the University of British Columbia. This is my first ever visit to Tokyo and to Japan, and so it's very lovely to be here. And I will not be using slides, so you'll actually have to, look at me for the entire time. And I hope that, I hope that this hour or 40 minutes with me is helpful to you in some way. So now, about a decade since writing this book called The Invention of Monolingualism in 2016, I have to concede how uncomplicated it was for me to critique and indict monolingualism in public back then. Because, after all, no one seemed all that interested back in 2016 in standing in monolingualism's defense. When seen through a socio-political lens, unredeemed by literature's communicative purposes and immersive enchantments, monolingualism was obviously a kind of unlikable thing. And though I tried quite hard in that book not to make monolingualism out to be a mere beast or a farce or a curable ailment, I did want to take it seriously as a worthy and genius adversary, one that is structured into colonial modernity in ongoing ways that are minutely banal, often advantageous to us, and hard to articulate and express honestly, especially when monolingualism still generally seems to be left in charge of structuring our very means of articulation in academic settings and social and political settings. So my coming 2024 book in the fall is called Literature in Late Monolingualism. And it's a study about this ongoing, sometimes remorse-filled literary and cultural love affair with the monolingual today in a current age that is otherwise awash with performative goodwill toward what we call multilingualism and translation and translatability. And I love the writer Joan Didion, who wrote in 1967, and I quote Joan Didion, "There has always been that divergence between what we say we want and what we do want, between what we say we admire and what we secretly desire, between, in the largest sense, the people we marry and the people we love." And sometimes it's a little bit hard to keep track which is which, and so there are various artifacts of monolingualism's intensity that haunt our everyday language in really kind of subtle ways. And so think for a second of all the ways this divergence between what we say we want and what we do want around the matter of monolingualism and multilingualism expresses itself in everyday phrases. And I'm going to use an English phrase here, but I'm sure there are phrases in Japanese that are quite like this. So every time in English, someone apologizes nervously to another person in a public forum for having, quote, butchered their name. This is something that people say in English all the time. "I'm so sorry for butchering your name." Monolingualism really hovers knowingly in the background of such a phrase, admonishing everyone present that such a mess could have been avoided if only the name and its exhausting pronounceability hadn't insisted on being there in the first place. So this always avoidable and yet gruesomely routine phrase, butchering a name, calls to collective consciousness a scene of physical violence in which this name in question bears its natural portion of shame for the indignity of having turned an otherwise conscientious host or speaker into a butcher, and for necessitating from them an otherwise uncharacteristic act of violence. And so I think we need, more of this kind of practical, what Raymond Connell calls dirty theory about these everyday discursive moments of monolingual consolidation, much as feminist and queer movements have always helped us to think about the everyday disaffordances of gender in the way we talk to each other, and how these are, always in need of our untiring, collective, and hard-won critical interventions. So for me, monolingualism means, and this is just a bit of a kind of airing out the definition a bit. Monolingualism means any approach, not necessarily a belief, but an approach that foresees that a single named language's repertoire of signs will always be the best and only necessary linguistic means for getting a whole job done. And in this context, a whole job can be any of the following. So telling a story, providing a credible account, offering evidence, being in community, constituting a state, loving another person, articulating an identity, doing justice, knowing the land, cooking a meal, anything, enacting policy, publishing a book, even in translation. Um, uh, Adjudicating a claim, teaching an idea, trading securities, any of these things. So in this way, monolingualism is a powerful tutor in language socialization, to cite Bambi Schefflin and Eleanor Oakes' concept from 1986, and in preserving, in some ways, the tyranny of existing concepts. But I turn in this new book to a concept I call late monolingualism. And late monolingualism is, I believe, one of the many kind of sociopolitical domains in which intense practical investment in an ideology doesn't necessarily reflect actual credence or belief or substantive conviction among its adherents and engineers. Late monolingualism is more of a kind of facilitative structure for economic optimization rather than the actual kind of trusty artifact of a belief system. It is a paradigm that has expediently opted to inherit what was proposed and bequeathed to it by its zealous high monolingual predecessors. So the accrued cultural, conceptual, and institutional capital put behind the unquestioned pretext of a world made up of well-bordered, pan-functional, named languages as the required vehicles for global commerce, communication, and political emergence. In the invention of monolingualism, I pushed a strong analytic separation between the historically well-honed epistemic and affective grooves of structural monolingualism. So what monolingualism sanctions for us to credibly know, do, convey, say, and feel through a given singularized language. And on the other hand, the actual people who might seek to operationalize those self-impositions of monolingualism in their practice. And so an obvious example of this is any literary author of novels who may or may not be monolingual in any personal way, but who may find reason, just when in a pinch or perhaps their whole life long, to use monolingualism for strategic, situational, aesthetic, or formal ends. So my insistence on distinguishing structure from person, and so distinguishing what Bourdieusians might call the field of monolingualism from its lived habitus in subjects or persons, stems from my belief that human linguistic subjectivity will always be more and less than, quote, monolingual. Each of our languaging lives, just think about your languaging lives, they might be chatty, they might be nonverbal, but they are replenished ongoingly via a rather splashy and abundant imaginary number of language repertoires, never via an orderly integer, never neatly countable and nameable as, say, English or Japanese. They're always a bit or a lot extra. And so monolingualism is this kind of impossible artificial construction, and yet in many ways it rules the road of international uh, traffic and meaning. Shortly after my 2016 book came out, my friends and I, of course, when Trump got elected, saw newly vengeful and unbridled forms of authoritarian linguistic nationalism and anti-Asian, anti-Black, anti-Latinx, anti-Muslim, anti-Jewish, and anti-Indigenous racist violence trying to reconquer Europe and the United States. The fierce critical rebellions against ethnic subjugation, against white supremacy and nationalism that had been gaining political ground since the 1990s seemed to have roused large swaths of the Anglophone white identifying US population, not to disavow and deplatform those pernicious structures, but rather to grotesquely re-elect and refortify racialized political monolingualism, sensing well enough all the while how decrepit and irreal such structures had become on their own tongues. So the Trumpist era's intersectionally transphobic, xenophobic, racist, and opportunistically disdainful animus toward language and languages was, I think, best expressed by Florida Governor Ron DeSantis at the July 2023 Family Leadership Summit when he and this guy named Tucker Carlson frothed together about a terrifying future where, quote, our kids and grandkids are memorizing 37 different pronouns in Mandarin. So this is the kind of mix of hostility towards non-binary gender identification and toward Asian languages together. So as far as political monolingualism and linguistic nationalism is concerned, I find that a surprising late reinvestment in these apparatuses since 2000, in the year 2000 in the UK, in the US, in Turkey, in Germany, and elsewhere, maybe in Japan, I don't really know, but you can tell me, seemed, I don't know, it seemed less of a proof of true belief or enthusiasm for monolingual life and monolingual order than of half-heartedly making do with a handy and comparably uncontroversial administrative instrument of monolingualism. So of retaining it as at least reliably operational for civic projects of exploitation, monetization, and exclusion. And of course, there's a big gulf between insisting that everyone needs to speak a certain language, a certain civic language, in order to get into a country and live there for a while, maybe for the sake of social cohesion. And on the other hand, claiming that such a national language must be acquired because that language is superior in its elegance, precision, cultural expressiveness, and philosophical depth. Of course, these are two very different strategic enactments of political monolingualism, and novels are a lush, because very overdetermined, scene for understanding when and whether the latter supremacist essentialist mode of monolingualism, or rather the former pragmatist mode, is being activated most intensively. So this next book that I'm working on coming out in November is called Literature in Late Monolingualism. And this is a book about the fretful lateness of monolingualism in the literary era this side of 2000. I'm just going to show you a couple of the novels that I'm working on. This is Amatka by Karin Tidbeck, self-translated from Swedish into English. This is Mirror Shoulder Signal by Dorte Nors, a novel from Danish, also translated by Misha Hoekstra into English. And so those are two of the novels that I'm working on in that book. There's also China Miéville's Space Odyssey Embassy Town and Neil Stephenson's gigantic techno-thriller Cryptonomicon. So these books, or the book I'm writing, is kind of just trying to understand the moody and foreboding hunch in the air about a kind of linguistically belated state of things in the age of artificial intelligence. I know everybody is dealing with the implications of artificial intelligence for everything from academic honesty to creative originality, et cetera. And so I'm trying to understand the way that novels deal with these questions of linguistic authenticity, and specifically some globally marketed Eurocentric authors like Tidbeck and Norse. So, the book that I'm writing is not a work in the sociology of literature, nor a really comprehensive data-driven study of diverse global literary industries and their supply chain infrastructures. It's a book of textual incitements and conceptual inquiry whose focus will be this kind of oddly alluring, jagged castle of single language immersiveness that we call monolingualism. And that is, I think, one of literature's very own and least cherished nightmares of the self. So this book considers an emerging set of literary novels that I term literature in late monolingualism. And what these works share is a willingness to observe and critique the industrial commercialization of their own translatability from their various cultural vantage points in Danish, Swedish, US American, and British letters. And of course, those who know Haruki Murakami also have probably been aware of the way that his novels have been kind of composed with translatability in mind. And that's one of the kind of features of his superstardom. So these works kind of find these genius ways, I think, to depict and problematize this controlled traffic in meaning between global languages and what I call the production of cheap meaning as an aesthetic, as a translingual aesthetic commodity. And they see in detail what infrastructure this literary traffic uses, whom and what it accelerates, whom and what it denies, and what aesthetic and semiotic sacrifices it makes along the way, so that these novels can preserve and uphold a passably monolingual form for the literary novel, and thereby avoid ending up stranded somewhere indefinitely in what Bashak Chandar, the comparatist, calls world literature's outsides. Lest there be doubt, this book is really fueled by my own personal belief that a near future world without the structuring powers of monolingualism is, in fact, ever possible, though not inevitable, not even probable under current conditions. But such a world is nonetheless always quite reasonably near at hand. And this is also likely why monolingualism must innovate ever more aggressively from age to age in a bid to capture our imaginations and our affections, and often through literary and other aesthetic means. So understanding monolingualism's affective workings on us and its insistence on holding on to power through literary novels and other media may help us envision that possibility in the century to come of a world uncaptured and uncaptivated by what we have right now, which is a globally enforced economistic fiat system of engineered supply-side monolanguages. And of course, there's other types of translanguaging repertoires throughout the world as well, but those are really quite aggressively suppressed by this fiat system of monolanguages. So faced with the 21st century's resurgent political and reinvestments in monolingualism, literature makers like Dorte Noors, Cod and Tidbeck and others have been implicated in this violent, ambivalent picture in new ways. They are increasingly alert to the thickening political instrumentalizations of exclusionary linguistic citizenship and linguistic lawfare around the planet. This is something that I call a jus linguarum, as opposed to a jus soli or a jus sanguinis system. So a law of languages that dictates who gets to be part of a civic community, depending on how they perform linguistic membership in a community. And so these novels are really curious about what it would mean for literature itself to give up its own monolingual privilege at all stages of literary production. And this historical designation, late monolingualism, is designed in part to shift the punitive scrutiny off of the word monolingual away from individual meaning-making persons and onto global political economy and transnational value chains. So much as Werner Sombart deployed the term late capitalism in 1902 to 1927, and later Ernst Mandl in 1972, the purpose of the term late monolingualism is to show that monolingualism is a changing, surprising, and historically sedimented, though not necessarily declining system. Its lateness refers not to an eventual demise, but to the unanticipated and resurgent intensity and innovativeness with which its defenders seek to uphold it, even when those defenders of monolingualism are not ideological nationalists in any conspicuous sense. And often they do so through discourses of so-called multilingualism or bilingualism. And on these kind of twisted discourses of mono-multilingualism, I'd encourage people to check out Robert Moore's essay on reactionary multilingualism from 2015, and Noah Katznelson and Katie Bernstein on rebranding bilingualism from 2017. So my provisional dating of the end of high monolingualism at 1948 with the drafting of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and this is something you can read about in Stephen Kellman's essay on that topic from 2016. This dating intends to suggest that the period between 1950 and 1980, which is also the heyday of machine translation, was a volatile gestation period for what would soon become a truly late monolingualism in the 1990s. And a key feature distinguishing late monolingualism from high monolingualism is that to the extent its mundane operations today are now wrapped up in the mystified realm we call artificial intelligence, late monolingualism is accelerated by the kinds of financial instruments that govern computational technology today. So the robust and unsupervised automated instruments of computational linguistics and engineering rely heavily, for instance, on deploying models through iteration without validation. So that is the tendency among language tech engineers to deploy unfinished models and products on the assurance that the public, us, the public's end users, will edit the bugs out of these platforms for free, instead of having the engineers themselves take pains on the supply side to identify and remove problems before initial market deployment. There's a really great essay on this by Dorish et al. 2020 called On Being Iterated. And this paradigm has particular consequences globally in the realm of linguistic practice, where iterative models launched and socialized as allegedly benign beta tests can cause acute extractivist effects or ongoing hardships for marginalized language communities and users whose practices do not align well with the dominant settler monolanguage upon whose premises the model is developed. So during this period, since 1990, a really profound change has taken hold in the way major planetary languages coordinate with one another through supply-side algorithmic cross-language information retrieval platforms and machine translation innovations. The optimal horizon for this endeavor is what I call ortolingual translatability, and that has become a key index for a certain dominant stratum of global commerce and industry, including, indeed, literary industry. In my 2021 book, The Invention of Multilingualism, I defined ortolingualism as, quote, the ongoing practice and principle of adjusting languages to one another into a global order that minimizes protectionism, opacity, decolonial resistance, and other barriers to the free flow of capital. And key to ortolingualism, just as much as to ordoliberalism, is that they appear to generously promote cultural expression and particularity, but do so only to a degree that does not hamper free trade. And so by supply side, I'm trying to suggest the ways in which engineered designs, premises, and products for language management are being promoted so as to comply and align with what technology innovators, so suppliers, foresee as imminently possible and deliverable, rather than with what users, so you and me, actually are saying that we want and need from language technology. So these two roughly explanatory poles of supply and demand are always, in an intricate iterative dance with one another. But language technology engineers today have amassed unprecedented license and funding to build hierarchies of linguistic infrastructure and multilingual management platforms that not even a sincerely interested layperson can reasonably understand. And of course, that's one of the topics and problems that Neil Stephenson writes about in his 1999 novel, Cryptonomicon, which it comes forth in my book. So these kind of new discursive expressions of monolingualism are indeed on the rise globally, I suggest, rather than on the decline. And we will, of course, want to know who is producing these structures and who benefits from them the most. So put another way, which version of the story of global linguistic order and innovation is helping to fortify rather than to dismantle monolingualism? And how is this fortification, paradoxically enough, achieved oftentimes most effectively by some ascendant models of neoliberal multilingualism, machine translation, and commodified translatability? So from this point of view, literary and aesthetic untranslatability is often a proxy discourse for a much wider and overdetermined set of anxieties about policy and revenue and planning and technology and markets and statescraft. And these kinds of questions cannot just be laid at the doorstep of literary and professional translators in their, capacity as individual practitioners. And indeed, the majority of translingual information traffic today across the world fueling our political economies occurs by way of corpus-based cross-linguistic information retrieval platforms and not under the careful eye and craft of individual translators or translation teams. So untranslatability, or what is sometimes called semiodiversity, that's Mac Halliday's term from 2002, is a potential barrier haunting these commercial purposes, except when a particular untranslatable gets successfully isolated as kind of a boutique sector item to be marketed in its own right, like, champagne or something. So, these platforms for computationally engineered platforms for inducing translatability aim to commensurate different languages to one another in late monolingualism so as to produce what Yassin Noorani calls soft multilingualism. So made up of languages full of increasingly securitized translatabilities. Late monolingualism, as I describe it, is an age where a certain set of about 100 major global languages, what Abram de Swaan 2004 calls central languages, become technologically fortified so as to facilitate unobjectionable and efficient content distribution across language barriers. And this is what I term linguistic xenos rights. This is a term from Quinn Slobodian's book, The Globalists from 2018. So the right to exert power over meaning in someone else's language. And as a reader of literature, I really want to understand how recent supply-side transformations in the newly managed world language system play out unevenly or surprisingly in the literary craft of multilingual novelists. And literature, of course, is a domain that is sometimes held up as more impervious to free market manipulations than other forms of cultural production. Pierre Bourdieu was talking about that in 1993. So the way that literature's aura of slowness, its aesthetic particularity, its presumed cultural specificity, and its linguistic and poetic precision somehow exempt itself from a lot of these alleged dynamics of the free market system. Not so much says late monolingualism. So in choosing works for this book, I wanted to, to pick novels that really got to this kind of question of the commercialization of translatability. But I also wanted to distinguish these novels from novels that wrestle with other historically related structures of constraint and subjugation. So there are, of course, ample and riveting novels written about linguistic imperialism. So Sharon Dodotu's Ada's Realm is a good example against, or novels about linguistic nihilism. So James Kelman's Translated Accounts, linguistic extractivism, Chikozi Opioma's An Orchestra of Minorities, linguistic standardization, so Chetan Bhagat's One Night at the Call Center, etc. And so, though the concerns of these kinds of novels are still also my personal concerns and are kindred and overlapping with those brought to the fore in the book, their varying techniques and critical premises matter in ways that often surpass the category of late monolingualism itself. And so, in the end, being in monolingualism, being subjected to, or subject to it in a compulsory way is neither a necessary diminishment of a novel's aesthetic quality overall, nor a mark against its potentially revelatory cultural politics around language and linguistic diversity. It simply means that most novels that succeed in publication and dissemination are still routinely implicated somehow in the refortification process that contemporary supply-side monolingualism demands. And a novel's role in, rather than its aloofness about monolingualism, is not happenstance nor hardship, nor do these novels yearn dismayed to get out of monolingualism, even when they clearly understand the social and epistemological damage it does and will continue to do to the world. It's routine for intellectual traditions around politics, culture, and literature to be designated as periods, however imprecise or revisionist those periods might end up being. So, Romanticism or the Great Society or Reconstruction or the Cold War, et cetera. But drastically less common is to see a periodization of, in, or about languages. So a fact that, in my view, suggests an enduring indifference about the relation between history and language in interdisciplinary knowledge production, in global manufacture, and in political economy. And so, what I'm trying to ask with this book is, what is the particular nature of the contemporary linguistic age around us? Is this age, this linguistic age since 1990, driven by popular language ideologies, by extra linguistic or language indifferent technological shifts, or by technological shifts in the very nature of languages and symbolic regimes? And what have been the kind of precursors and preparatory discourses for this age? So the novels that I try to discuss in this book help to think about how the 30-odd years since 1990, so a window really spanning the rollout and refinement of algorithmic cross-language information retrieval capacities, how this age has enabled a new paradigm in matters of language and meaning. And endemic to this age is the supply-side management of global multilingualism through pathways that primarily, I think, serve commercial clients, security agendas, and borderless market stratagems by reducing the time and expense necessary for translation and other forms of cross-language conviviality. So the novels and novelists foregrounded in this book also devote significant attention to the changing norms and instruments of the trade publishing industry, which had been transnationalized since the mid-1980s. And John Thompson has a great book on that called Merchants of Culture in 2010. So it's not too much, I think, to wager that most literary artists since that corporate transnational turn in the 1980s and 90s, and particularly those who write in a language other than English, have experienced to different differing intensities and in different constellations this profound impact of the automatization and coordination of multilingualism, and not just the effects of late capitalism more generally on literature. They kind of glimpse this looming managerial apparatus, sometimes in the conception, acquisition, and composition process, but also later or simultaneously in the translation, copywriting, contracting, and marketing of their works. They have also witnessed the ways in which such coordinated multilingualisms abet Anglophone, Anglocentric, Anglogenic processes. So not all published literature today is doing this, but published literature has always found itself adhering to new and overwhelming demands, which can issue quite abruptly from the technological relations that surround and consume it. And these literary texts in late monolingualism are really, I think, exquisite expressions and performances of a certain orderly translingual infrastructure that has desired and produced them, a supply chain of human relationships requiring a logistically sophisticated manufacture for the least expensive conveyance of meaning to allegedly monolingual end users of literature. And so here we see an emerging corollary to sociologist Jason Moore's 2016 conception of the production of cheap nature in the literary provision of what I call cheap meaning. And another question is what distinguishes late monolingualism from high monolingualism in and beyond literature? How different are literary enactments of late monolingualism from other, civic or industrial or political or communicative enactments more broadly? So if the premise of high monolingualism, which I periodized from 1789 in Paris to 1948 in Paris, was the alternatingly essentialist and pragmatist centralization of language use around the available nation-state form, often through violently oppressive re-educational and military means. Late monolingualism reflects a reluctant but unequivocal truce with the interests of global capitalism and economic anti-protectionism, which it acknowledges has won out over nationalist attempts at cultural sovereignty expressed through language. Though Pramila Nadasan 2023 has argued that the global care industrial complex is expressing today the, quote, highest stage of capitalism, I grasp the monolanguage industrial complex as a strong and related competitor for this distinction. It mobilizes global value chains and encases people in proprietary technologies that ensure that fewer and fewer of us who have access to those technologies will ever feel the need to actually learn and use new languages ourselves anymore. And even in traditionally elite pedigree spaces for cosmopolitan formation and education, so so-called language immersion programs are shortening and thinning, while state universities are frequently found acting out their globally inclusive fiduciary mandate by closing all language programs on campus and relying instead on the delusional conceit of a universally accessible Anglophone common denominator for all learning and communicating. So I recognize in closing that this talk will probably not have made a whole lot of sense for people who feel in the end that we all individually still have control of our languages and that any institutional, technological, and political pressure structuring what can be said, where, how, and when, literarily or otherwise, is relatively easily overcome with a little courage, grit, and criticality. It will also not have made a whole lot of sense for those who do not think that monolingualism exists because they claim sociolinguistic diversity is actually the real on-the-ground fact of planetary and local communication now and forever, and will always win out over monolingual small-mindedness. But what I have tried to suggest in this talk is not an evil new prison house of language called late monolingualism, nor a doomed scenario of disempowerment, but rather a range of ways that these kind of novels think about the complex and elusive business of linguistic subjectivity in the 21st century in the midst of a profound shift in transnational commerce around languages and meanings that will last at least until 2040 or so. And this is a time when we, whoever we are, still wish to be free and just and vigorous users of all of the languages that we have labored so hard to learn and love. So thank you so much for listening.
Thank you very much, Professor Gramling, for that critical insight into the state of late monolingualism and its manifestations in literary texts, and for taking the time to speak with us today. I would also like to thank Tokyo College for giving us this opportunity today, and also my colleagues for helping to co-organize this series. To learn about other lectures in our monolingualism and multilingualism series, as well as other events, please check out our YouTube channel or website linked in the description. Thank you again, and goodbye.